Om Asato Ma Sadagamaya Tamaso Homaham Jyotirgamaya Mrityormam Amritam Gamaya Avir Avir Maerhi Rudra Yate Dakshinam Mukham Te Namaham Pahinityam. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Reach us through and through ourselves, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. So my subject this morning is work as worship. And we're going to be talking about karma yoga and about spiritualizing everyday life. The goal of karma yoga is simply stated, Jivan Mukti Sukha Prapti Hedo Hi Janmadaranam. The goal and purpose of karma yoga is to attain the happiness of living freedom. The method of karma yoga is very simple. It's about renouncing the fruits of action, not anticipating the results of an action, not hurrying and rushing forward to reach the finish line, but making the means the end. The maxim is, be here now. No daydreaming, no mind wandering. Just work with detachment and begin to feel the subtle freedom of the soul. That's what Ernest Hemingway defined freedom as: easy in the harness. Can't get out of the harness, but you can feel easy in the harness. The simplest form of karma yoga we've discussed on another occasion. It's called work for work's sake. This morning we're going to be talking about another kind of karma, the different kinds of karma yoga. Simplest form is work for work's sake. This morning we're going to be talking about doing work as worship. That is, we're going to bring Ishvara into the picture. Ishvara is the God of Vedanta. And we're going to bring religious language into the picture. And our subject this morning is kind of, this path is, we may say it's kind of a hybrid between simple karma yoga and bhakti yoga. But doing work as worship is a form of karma yoga, as we're discussing it this morning. That is a form of selfless work. Now we say work as worship. Sometimes the question may arise in your mind about worship of God. Why should you, that is, we may ask ourselves, why should I worship God? And the answer to that question is, well, maybe it's not phrased quite properly from the point of view of the Vedanta philosophy. It's not that we shouldn't have the word should in there. There's no should. The fact of the matter is that, well, there's a good reason to worship God if you so choose. God is infinitely good. And God is infinitely good to us. God has created the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth and the trees and all the flowers and all the heat and the light and the life. Everything has been created by God. And therefore it is natural for a jivatman, that is ourselves, an embodied soul. It's natural for an embodied soul, when they are in the presence of the supernatural, that is in the presence of God, to worship and to serve. That's the natural psychological response. Now usually when we think about worshiping God, we think about a worship service in a church or a temple. And on a Sunday morning, and that's our idea of worship of God. But in the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna gives us a very expanded, broadened idea about what is worship, what is true worship. And Sri Krishna says, Yat karoshi yadashnasi, yat karoshi dadasiyat, yat tapasyasi kaunteya, tat kurushva vadarpanam. Arpana means an offering. And there in the verse it says, Yat karoshi yadashnasi, whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever is your work or your activities during the day, sacred or secular, do that as an offering to me. We see here that he's giving us a very wider picture of what worship of God can mean, and that worship need not be confined to a church or a temple or any particular time or place. Now usually when we think about work, we're going to talk about work as worship. And the exercise here is thinking as. That is, you're not going to make your work literally into a religious worship. But we're going to see the work in the light of worship. Usually when we think about worship, for example, we can begin. When we think about a worship, we think about a sacred ritual. In a church, maybe we can imagine, if you've attended in a Roman Catholic cathedral, maybe you've seen a full celebration of the Mass as the priest enters into comes into the inner sanctum and goes on the altar. He's surrounded all by the articles and the instruments of the Eucharist, and a hush falls over the congregation. Maybe there's some chanting, some sacred verses in Latin. He begins the process of the worship. There is an aura of a feeling of the sacred in the cathedral. And if we watch the priest, we could see that the whole thing is it's kind of a meditation in action. It has aesthetic qualities, and it's a spiritual activity. And the idea here is, with that image in mind, we can begin to think that we can see many of our own activities, that is, our ordinary activities. This is what karma yoga is about. It's about how to spiritualize ordinary activities. Seeing that getting that feeling of the sacred in our everyday work. For example, we can just think about preparing our dinner one day. Maybe you're cooking dinner for your family or your friends. And if you're a devotee, maybe you will do your work as worship. That is, as you enter, you offer the fruits of the work to God. You begin with a prayer. As you enter into the kitchen, everything is clean, everything is arranged nicely. You've prepared, everything is in order. You have the Bible, that is, your cookbook is there. And there you are, the pots and pans are your instruments and your utensils of worship. You proceed slowly, methodically through your process, putting your full mind on your work. Your mind is not wandering here and there, daydreaming, listening to the radio, none of that. Rather, we're working, doing the work as an offering to God. And then to serve the food. As I say, what's the secret here? You well, tender, loving care, right? That's the secret ingredient. TLC, we serve the food to our guests or to your family, who are embodiments of forms of God. And thus we try in our mind to spiritualize everyday life. Well, it may sound to be a little going from the sublime of the Mass in the service of the Eucharist to the preparing our dinner in our kitchen. That may seem to be going from the sublime to the ridiculous. But I remember one time walking down, this was in October, was long ago, walking down the streets in Calcutta, India, in the month of October. It was during the Durga Puja season, the Navaratri celebration, the worship of Durga images everywhere in the city, on every major intersection, street corner. An air of festivity everywhere in the city. And as I walked down the street there towards the Institute of Culture, I passed by happened to pass by a shop that was well, maybe we could call it a Indian automotive shop. It's like a auto repair shop. Well, they repair everything in there, of course. Bicycles and motorbikes and scooters, some cars. And there, as I looked, I saw there's a mechanic's shop. There was a place there where they could maybe balance tires. There were some racks of tools. And noticed that on the tools themselves there were flowers. On the machines there were flowers. No pictures of gods and goddesses. It's just all of the tools and the machinery in the shop were decorated, and incense was burning. And then I realized that this is the day of the Ayuda Puja, the 9th day of the Navaratri celebration, where in India, they worship the tools of the trade. And not just the tools, it goes because it coincides with the Saraswati Puja, so she's the goddess of wisdom and of music, and so the musical instruments also are decorated in books. And soldiers worship their weapons. It's all about weaponry, because as you know the story of Durga, how she defeated the great demon Mahishasura. Why? She had many weapons, so the others had enabled them to defeat the demons. And so on this day, the soldiers worship their weapons, and the auto mechanics pay reverence to the tools of their trade. And in so doing, they kind of represent a great Vedantic idea, and that is the idea that in true spirituality, we erase the distinction between the sacred and the secular. It's not as if there's two. There's the church, and then there's ordinary secular life. That all of our work is to be done as worship. Now, in doing work as worship, we visualize the externals, maybe holding in our imagination a church service and a ritual worship. But now we can consider maybe the interior, the mind and heart of the devotee. And the devotee, in doing this form of karma yoga, assumes the attitude of the servant of God. In Sanskrit, it's called the dasya bhava. See, we're talking here about a relationship between the jivatman and the paramatman. That is the ego, and between God, you have to have a relationship. What are the relationships? Well, they're very clearly defined. There are 5 in number. And one of them, in this particular case, is called the dasya bhava. That is the attitude of the servant. We cannot get rid of the ego. No matter how much you work, you can never really get rid of the ego. Sri Ramakrishna says the bay tree, you cut down the bay tree with a chainsaw, and everything's cut down. You go back the next day and you see little shoots coming up. We can never get rid of the ego. Therefore, Sri Ramakrishna says, let the rascal remain as the servant ego. Good. He's going to be there anyhow. He'll be the servant ego. And it's a familiar image to us. Those of us, Judeo-Christian tradition, you remember in the Christian, the parables of Jesus, the New Testament, the Christian Bible, they speak of the good servant. The good servant is one who, what are the characteristics of a good servant? Well, certainly he obeys the 10 Commandments of his master. If we're going to talk about his behavior, what are his actions? Karma here, the word work as worship, we're talking by work here, we mean karma. And by karma, we mean particular dharma. That is to say, your actions during the day. What are your actions? Well, they must be dharmic. That is, they must be in accord with the commandments of God, with the divine law. And so the good servant works in Christian language, we would say, that the good servant is one who follows the 10 Commandments and the Golden Rule. and who is a man of upstanding, who is a man of moral character. Certainly he is a good servant, is one who does good works. Good works are those which are pleasing to God and which bear good results, which benefit everyone. But being a good person, being a moral person, and doing good works is not enough to qualify for the practice of karma yoga. That is, it's not enough just to be a good servant, a good man. You have to be a godly man. This karma yoga, as with all the yogas, we always have to remember these are avenues of the mystic way. And the mystic way means that the purpose of all the yogas is to have a personal experience of the divine. That's the purpose. And that means generally, that's what mysticism is about, having a personal experience of the supernatural, that is of the transpersonal, of the superconscious in general. Now we use the word mystic in a more discriminating sense in Vedanta, but we're not going to talk about that. We're talking about particularly about the Raja Yogi, but here in more general terms. And therefore karma yoga is one of these, is in that sense, is a mystic path. And mysticism is all about, that is the first steps. The first steps in any mystic path, it's all about what Evelyn Underhill called spiritual alchemy. That means it's about purgation and about purification of the gold of the soul. That is the golden servant. We can imagine the servant of God. See, there are different kinds of the servant ideal. There are different kinds of servants we could imagine. There's a bad servant, and there's a worse servant, and then there's the worst servant, and then there's a good servant, and then there's a better servant, and then there's the best servant. And we can imagine the best servant. That's the ideal. This is our highest ideal. And that means our goal and our purpose is, in the language of yoga psychology, is to begin to sublimate our activities from the gross to the subtle to the causal, from the tamas to the rajas to the sattva, the sattvic person. That's the Raja, the best Raja Yoga, the ideal, Karma Yogi, the ideal here of doing work as worship. The worship, the successful Karma Yogi has become a worshiper. That is, he's become a saintly person. He's become a spiritual person. In order to do work as worship, you have to be a spiritual person. Spiritual person means you live in the spirit. And what does spirit mean? Living in the spirit means that you've risen above selfish desires and the attachments of the natural man. You've risen above that. In order to do this karma yoga, remember the first step is to renounce the fruits of the action. That means that you have to have purified yourself, purified the gold of the soul from some of that dross. That means your selfish desires, that grasping, the anticipation for the end, the wanting of the end, the results of the action. And one of the greatest helps in this practice of this form of karma yoga, doing work as worship, one of the great help, the tools, you know, all the different yogas, each one has its own tool. The tool here of the doing work as worship, we could say, is the offertory prayer. Now you see how we're getting religious language into the practice of karma yoga. And the offertory prayer, that means that when we begin our activity, our project for the day, one of our ordinary activities that we do in the course of our daily work, we want to begin, it would be helpful for us to begin to put ourselves into the mindset of the worshiper. That means to offer the fruits of the work to God. That is just to say a simple prayer to ourselves, O Lord, I offer all that I am going to do now. And during this day, offer to you, offer the fruits of the action to you. Help me to work with focus and concentration and to work with detachment. It's a simple prayer. Maybe we can make that prayer at the very beginning of our day, anticipating all the activities that we are going to do during the day. If we remember starting some big project, we can remember the simple prayer. At the end of the day, maybe we can remember to offer all that we've done, the fruits of the action, to God. This form of karma yoga assumes you believe in God. And fact is, you have to believe in God. If you don't believe in God, then you have huge, gigantic problems. I mean, like philosophical problems, just to begin with. So you offer the fruits of your action to God. And then you do your karma yoga, as I said before. And the offertory prayer. Remember the Sri Ramakrishna had a devotee. By the way, this whole of this karma yoga, of course, assumes the assumption here before we even begin. All of the yogas, they assume that we have that we've cleaned up our life, that we don't have any, that we're not we're not victims here of the 7 deadly sins. This is just assumed. This is not even discussed. That is, when they say doing work as worship, they assume that your work is dharma. So you can't rob a bank as worship. You can't do that. Because the work here, what they're assuming is karma. They'd say karma is dharma. That's all. That's an assumption which we begin with. I don't know why I said that, but here I can tell this incident here of Surendranath Mitra, who was a devotee of Sri Ramakrishna. He would come to the Dakshineshwar temple, and he was a great devotee, and he wanted to practice, do spiritual practices as instructed by his master. But his problem was that every time when he would leave the temple and on his way home, he would stop at a tavern and he would drink wine. And so that was his problem. And He asked one day Sri Ramakrishna about what he could do. And Sri Ramakrishna says, oh, well, you know, remember Sri Ramakrishna, as he would, going in carriage, and the carriage sometimes on his way to Dakshineshwar, he would pass by one of these shops. We don't know exactly what these shops were. Sometimes they're translated as a grog shop, right? But that's kind of Australian lingo for a shop that's kind of like an unlicensed liquor store where they sell cheap homemade liquor. But whatever this was, on the way, well, remember how Sri Ramakrishna, on his way back, riding in a hackney carriage, he'd pass by one of these shops and he'd hear the inside, they'd be singing and they'd be drinking and singing, and the sound of the voices of the singing voices would come out into and the carriage would be going by. Ramakrishna would hear those voices and he'd lean out the window. He'd say, ah, yes, you see, intoxicated with the wine of heavenly love. He thought they were all in there singing the name and glories of God. And but yes, Ramakrishna then gave him advice. He said, whenever you go, he says, no problem. He says, and kind of in the spirit of our subject this morning, whatever you do, whatever your ordinary activities are, that when you order that glass of wine, before you drink it, why don't you say an offertory prayer? Why don't you offer the glass to the Divine Mother, to the Divine Mother Kali? And then take it as her prasad. That was his advice. And so, sure enough, Surendranath Mitra, he went there the next day, he did exactly that. And the next day, that became his practice. Offer the glass to the Divine Mother Kali and take it as her prasad. But of course, he began to feel a little cognitive dissonance there. Because after all, if you have offered it to God, if you've offered the fruits of the action to God, you can't very well enjoy them yourself. That wouldn't be quite right. So he felt he really couldn't enjoy this glass as he used to. And of course, little by little, he began to reduce. Remember, Swami Vedarupananda says there in one of his lectures there in London, he said someone told a man who used to love to drink gin. Someone told him that he heard this rumor that they put castor oil into the gin. Somebody told him that rumor, and he was so credulous. He thought, what? And every time then he started drinking, he'd order a glass, he'd order some gin, he'd drink it. He said, this tastes like castor oil. He finally gave up drinking gin. So that was, the point is the offertory prayer. Sounds like a simple thing, but actually it kind of helps us to realign our priorities and our attitudes and our activities, may help us to reevaluate what we're doing, to remember that we're trying to do work as worship. So don't underestimate the simple prayer. Simply, once again, the idea is bringing Ishvara into the picture. That alone itself is a big thing. And you remember how there was a devotee of the Lord Vishnu. His name was Narada. Many stories are told of Narada because he lived for thousands of years. And he was the greatest of the devotees. All day long he would sing the name and glories of God. He would do kirtan and bhajan. And one day, visiting the Lord Vishnu in Vaikuntha, he asked the Lord, he said, Lord, who is the best of your devotees? And the Lord Vishnu said, oh, well, let's see. He said, I'll show you. And so he gave him clairvoyant vision, and they went on a path of light, and they're up in the clouds. They looked down. It's early one morning. He says, look down there. You see that farmhouse? Yeah, you see there? There's a farmer. He's just getting up, you see? Now what is he doing? Oh, he just goes to the shrine room. See, he's making an offertory prayer. Lord, all that I do today, please, I offer the fruits of the action to you. And then he had his breakfast. He went out in the fields, and he's plowing the fields, and he's hoeing in the garden, working, came back, had lunch with his wife, went out and again in the fields, worked all afternoon, and then came back. After supper, he went to the door of the shrine room, saluted the Lord, and said, Lord, I offer all this that I've done today to you. Meanwhile, Narada and Lord Vishnu, up in the clouds, they're looking down. Vishnu says, you see that? He is my best devotee. And Narada, hearing that, what? So he thought about it all night. Very next morning, he goes to Lord Vishnu, and he said, Lord, I've been thinking about this. What do you mean? This man is your best devotee. He said, he didn't do any bhajan. Didn't do any kirtan. I didn't see him doing any worship, doing any rites, rituals. Didn't think of you at all during the day. All he did was plowed, and hoed in his garden. Yeah, that's true, said Vishnu. He said, but I tell you, can you do one thing for me? He says, I'd like you to. I have a jar, big clay pot. It's filled with kind of a sacred coconut oil. Very full. It's full right up to the top. Could you put this on your head? And I want you to walk, as they do in India. You put the big jar on your head. I want you to walk. See if you can go around Vaikuntha. It's going to take you maybe the whole day. But come back. Please don't spill even a drop. And Narada said, oh yes, no problem. So he put that pot of oil on his hot, very carefully, with great concentration, great focus. He began to walk slowly, walked all day long, all morning. Walked, all afternoon, came back. Late in the afternoon, he returned. And there he set the pot down before Lord Vishnu. Lord Vishnu looked there, he said, yep, sure enough. Hadn't spilled a single drop. He said, well, that's very good. He said, by the way, Narada, how many times did you think of me during the day? And Narada says, what? He said, I couldn't think of you. I was thinking about this pot. Couldn't take my mind off the pot. And then Vishnu said, well, you see this farmer, he had similar activities during the whole of it, but at least he thought about me twice. You didn't even think about me once. That's why I consider him to be the greatest of the devotees. So, well, that's the story of Narada. And nobody knows where this Vaikuntha is. Is it a mountain? No. Is it a city? Well, maybe. City of many palaces, because something's going on in every palace. Actually, maybe it's better to call it a loka. But whatever. Here's the person who does karma yoga, who does work as worship. It's obvious that if you're working with focus, you're working with concentration, you're doing a karma yoga, the natural effects, the mind is going to become a little more calm. This is a gradual process. The mind becomes more calm and collected. You will become more detached. You will become more objective, more concentrated, and certainly these psychological qualities will reflect themselves in your work. And thus, because they reflect, those qualities reflect themselves in your work, you will develop what Sri Krishna says in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, a kind of a skill in action. Buddhiyukto jhatiha ubhe sukrita dushkrite tasmat yogaya yujjaswam yoga karmasu kaushalam. That's the phrase. Yoga karmasu kaushalam. Yoga is skill in action. Now what does that mean? Whole reams of commentaries have been written on that single phrase of the verse. What it means, of course, particularly, is skill in action means that you have skill in when you're navigating sukrita dushkrite. That means the happiness and the misery. That means the raga and the dvesha. You've got to kind of move between the raga and the dvesha of karma yoga. That's one thing as a karma yogi. You always have to check your raga dvesha index. Because if you have raga and if you have dvesha, it's not karma yoga. That means you've got to walk between, at least you have to become aware. First step, at least, is awareness. But the skill here is to move between those and to work with detachment. And if you can, you will develop a kind of a skill in action. Now there's another way that we can interpret that, and that is I remember that we had a book in the monastery in San Francisco. And the title of the book was Work and Worship. And it was a book about it was published by the New York Graphic Society, and it was a beautiful coffee table book. So it was an oversized book with colored, high-quality photographs. It was a book about the economic community of the Shakers. The Shakers. Shakers were a sect of Quaker who came and settled in the states of the New England in the early 7th, or very early 18th century, 17th century. And they formed communities. And they were religious communes. And their motto of the founder of the Shaker communities, their motto was to put your hands to work and your heart, put your hands to work and your hearts to God. That's the motto. Put your hands to work and your hearts to God. And that's what they did. And everything that they did in a Shaker community, the ideal was, in the early idealistic days, was to do all the work as service of God. And whenever they did their cooking in the kitchen, baking of breads, they're going out and working in the fields, plowing the fields, working with machinery, building their own machinery, building their own tools, making their own tools, making all their own clothes, everything made from scratch. And in that book, there are the pictures of all those. Those communities are long gone now, but still some of those implements remain. Some of the Shaker furniture, some of the clothing, some of the utensils that were made. And as you look there, and those going through that beautiful art book, you can see that every piece of furniture, it has you look at a chair, it has a kind of an austere beauty, a kind of an elegant simplicity, a kind of a purity of a chair, a purity of form, purity. That's one of the rules of aesthetics. Anything that is superfluous is ugly. There's nothing ugly about a shaker chair. There's nothing superfluous about it. There's no designs. There's no little carvings or little this or that. It's just the pure essence of chair. That it has the necessary and sufficient conditions to be a chair, and that's all. And that's what makes it beautiful, because it represents the Platonic, kind of like the Platonic form. And so that's why even today, shaker furniture and what's left of their handmade crafts are collected in museums and are regarded as very expensive collector's items. So I just thought that would be an illustration there of, as he says, yoga karmasu kaushalam. Yoga is skill in action. What does that mean? It means that the mind of the worshiper, it reflects itself in the work that you do. You do quality work. That's karma yoga. Karma yoga means doing, of course you'll do quality work. You're not in a rush. Your mind's not wandering. You're not listening to the radio. You're not watching TV. You're working with focus. You have a kind of a sacred project you're working on. We can see it's a very high ideal. True. It's a mystic ideal. It's an otherworldly ideal. You think, gee, I don't do stuff like that. Of course not. That's why this is an otherworldly mystic ideal. But it's an ideal. The thing is, it's an ideal. And that ideal is there. We can think of a good example here. Let me look here at this clock. We think of it a good example in the lives of the Christian mystics. The person that comes to mind is a story about Brother Lawrence. Now, Brother Lawrence was a lay brother in a Carmelite monastery in the 17th century in Paris, France. And he was too old to join the monastery, so he joined as a lay brother. And there he followed the routine of the monastery. These are discalcid Carmelites, a very austere monastery. And in the morning, of course, they rise there and they do their chanting and they do their prayers. And then during the day, they have their work. And Brother Lawrence was assigned to the busy monastery kitchen. And there he found himself during the day in the kitchen with a clatter of pots and pans and many other the cooks, and he was just assisting there, and there was a whole army of cooks and people preparing the food for the monastery. And at first he began to feel a little conflict between those quiet morning hours of prayer and his work in the busy kitchen. But as time went on, he evolved a kind of an intimate spiritual practice, which he describes in detail in a famous book here, classic of Christian mystic literature. It's called The Practice of the Presence of God. That means he brought Ishvara into the picture. And thus he was able to spiritualize everyday life. And there in one passage at the end of the book, there he says that the time of business for me is no different from the time of prayer. He says, I have a feeling, even amidst the busy work of the kitchen, when people are calling for this and that, and food is being prepared, and there's hustle and bustle, and people are being served, Even amidst all that activity, he said, I feel the same tranquility that I feel when I'm on my knees at the Blessed Sacrament. So that's kind of a correspondence there in Christian mysticism and our subject here doing work in the spirit of worship. In the Indian tradition, of course, the great ideal, the highest ideal of the servant ideal, Dasya Bhava, is represented by the great monkey god Hanuman. Hanuman was a servant of God, that is of Rama, seventh incarnation of Vishnu. And Rama is the personification, not Rama, but Hanuman is the personification of this ideal of doing work as worship. He's the personification of the mystic servant ideal. And if you read there in so many stories about Rama, about Rama and Hanuman, one of the themes that comes through, one of those themes is that the servant, one of the characteristic of themes associated with Hanuman is that the servant partakes of the servant has the power which is comparable to the master. And if you're serving God, that is infinite power, that you yourself, as the servant of God, have super normal powers. And Hanuman had these powers, which he exemplified on many different occasions. One in particular, remember how at the end of the war there, Ravana, slain in Ceylon, and there Lakshmana, the brother, lying there, wounded, ill. What can he do? Well, he needs a special herb that grows only in the foothills of the Himalayas, this particular mountain in the Himalayan mountains. So they say we have to get that, we have to bring that, or how are we going to get that? That's 1,000 miles away, north or the north. Hanuman says, well, I'll go. So he just jumped up, flew through the air. Well, he had the power. Flew through the air, got there to the mountain, looked around. He said, well, they said it was this mountain. I thought he looked around, it wasn't there, couldn't find it. He says, okay, I'll just take the whole mountain. So he just uprooted the whole mountain, flew back to Ceylon. He found, oh, there's the herb, very good. Lakshmana was cured. So like that, the servant partakes of the power of the master. And we get power from that which we serve. And you remember how Hanuman, after this whole story of the battle between Rama and the demons, the Rakshasas of Ceylon, after that was all over, in the court, now Rama is the king, and Sita is the queen. And Hanuman comes into the court, filled with the courtiers and the ministers, and Sita comes down from her throne, and she gives him a pearl necklace as a token of their gratitude for his help. And Hanuman, a big monkey, he took that pearl necklace and he began to bite into the pearls. He bit one pearl, looked at it, threw it away. Bit another pearl, bit it, threw it away. And the people in there were saying, the ministers said, what, this is such a precious thing. What is he? What a foolish monkey he is. What is he doing? Sita says, well, why don't you ask him? So they asked, why are you throwing those? Oh, he said, well, I'm checking the pearls. He said, I don't keep anything that doesn't have an image of Lord Rama, that is my chosen ideal, that is God. If God is not in it, he said, I don't keep it. I don't want it. And then the minister is a little cynical. They say, yes, yeah, well, you throw away this expensive necklace, but what about your body? You keep that, don't you? How about that? Is Rama in your body? And then Hanuman takes his big claws, like this. He tears his chest open. And there you see, there's the image of Rama in his chest. Well, that's a famous image, immortalized in many Indian paintings and iconography. And it kind of represents the servant ideal. And in fact, to the extent that we can do our work, remembering God, thinking of God, and doing work as worship, we will begin to spiritualize everyday life. Om Dyo Shantihi Antariksha Ham Shantihi Prithivi Shantihi Apa Shantihi Oshadaya Shantihi Vanaspataya Shantihi Vishwe Deva Shantihi Brahma Shantihi Sarabha Shantihi Shantireva Shantihi Same Shantiredhi Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. Om, peace is in heaven, peace is on the earth, peace is in the sky and in the waters. The herbs and plants and trees are full of peace. The gods are peaceful. May this eternal universal peace enter our souls and beings. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all.